In the fall of 2008, a man named Walt Renner stood at the edge of his own gravel drive in Coyle County, Oklahoma, and watched a tannery truck back up to his fence line and dump a load of scrap hide into the bar ditch. The truck was a clean white flatbed with the Consolidator's logo on the door, and it left a smell behind it, the chemical sourness of chrome salts that did not belong on Walt's ground and never had. The driver did not get out. A man in a clean quilted vest leaned from the passenger window, a clipboard balanced on his knee, and called across the cold air that the county had no use for a leather man anymore, that the trade had moved to Bangladesh and to machines, and that Walt should do himself a favor and sell the lot for pasture before the bank made the decision for him. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes is a kindness. He used a word that stuck. He called the old tannery shed a museum. 13 years later, in the spring of 2021, a buyer for a saddle house in Fort Worth signed a single purchase order across that same kitchen table, and the figure written on the bottom line was $41,000 for one season of finished tree-fit saddles. Between those two moments lies a span of 13 winters, one inherited stone vat, a grandson who came home with a business degree and a head full of objections, and a drought that broke the men who did everything the modern way. Let me tell you how the scrap a tannery threw in a ditch became the only thing in that county worth waiting 2 years to buy. Stay with me, because the number at the end is smaller than you expect, and it lands harder for it. Walt Renner was 61 years old that fall, and he was known in Coyle County for two things. He was the slowest talker at the sale barn, a man who could let a question sit in the air for the better part of a minute before he answered it, and he was the only person within 100 miles who still knew how to take a raw cowhide and turn it into leather that would outlast the man who bought it. His hands told the second story before he ever opened his mouth. They were stained, the deep brown of oak bark clear to the wrist. The color worked so far into the creases that no soap had touched it in 40 years, and the right thumb sat at a slight crook where a fleshing knife had caught it in 1979. The man in the quilted vest was named Dale Pruitt. He was 44. An account manager for the regional hide consolidator that had bought up every small tannery between Tulsa and Amarillo, and he was not a bad man. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make him the villain, and he was not one. Dale believed, sincerely and with the full weight of a business degree and 20 years of margins behind him, that the old vegetable tanning trade was dead the way the blacksmith trade was dead. He had numbers. He had a chart that showed labor cost per hide in a chrome tanning plant against the labor cost of a man standing over a pit for 8 weeks, and the chart was not close. He had shown that chart to Walt once 2 years before the dump, spreading it on the hood of his truck with a pen for a pointer, walking down the columns the way a doctor walks a patient through a scan. Optimize the throughput, he had said, and the per-unit cost falls to where the market lives. Walt had looked at the chart for a moment and said that a chart could not feel a saddle, and Dale had smiled the patient smile of a man who has heard sentiment before and knows where it leads. To Dale, dumping the scrap at Walt's gate was almost a kindness. It saved the consolidator a disposal fee, and it gave a stubborn old man one last batch to play with before the inevitable. To Walt, the load in the ditch was something else entirely. He walked out to it the next morning with his dog, a rangy blue heeler named Tick, who had ridden in his truck for 9 years and slept across the threshold of the tannery shed every night of his life. The frost had not burned off yet, and the pile sat dark and stiff in the ditch, steaming faintly where the morning sun touched it. Walt crouched at the pile and lifted one of the discarded pieces, A belly cut the chrome plant had rejected for a brand scar, and he turned it in the gray light the way another man might turn a coin. The consolidator saw a flaw. Walt saw a hide that had simply lived, that carried the record of its own animal honestly, and that would take vegetable tan as deep and as evenly as any clean back in the load. He ran his thumb along the grain, felt the weight of it, set it aside, and lifted another. He carried 4 pieces back to the shed that morning, one at a time, his breath clouding in the cold. He left the rest, but he made a note in a ledger that the truck had come and the date, because Walt Renner wrote down everything that happened on his ground, the way his grandfather had taught him. Under the date, he wrote 3 words and nothing more. Good hide wasted. He underlined it once the way Otto would have, and closed the book and went to work, because the work did not care what the consolidator believed, and never had. Let me tell you about that ledger, because it is the spine of this whole story. It was not Walt's ledger to begin with. It had belonged to his grandfather, Otto Renner, a German immigrant who had come up through the river-bottom tanneries of Missouri and crossed into the Oklahoma Territory in 1907 with a wagon, a breeding sow, and a wooden chest of bark tanning recipes written in a cramped, slanted hand. Otto had built the first stone vat on the Renner place with his own hands, hauling limestone from a creek cut 2 miles north, 1 sledge load at a time across a single brutal summer. And he had set the vats below the frost line so the barked liquor would hold an even cool through the binding weeks. Into that ledger he had recorded, season after season, the one thing the chrome plants would spend the next century trying to engineer their way around. He recorded time. Walt remembered the old man only dimly, a tall, stooped shape at the edge of a vat in the last summer of Otto's life. But he remembered one thing clearly. Otto had taken Walt's small hand and pressed it flat against a hide hung to dry, and held it there, and said in his heavy accent that the leather would tell you when it was ready and never before, and that a man who could not wait had no business at the pits. Walt had been 7. He had not understood it. He had spent the next 50 years learning that it was the only thing worth understanding. Vegetable tanning is not complicated to describe. It is brutally hard to do well. You take the raw hide, you clean it, and you soak it. And then you move it through a series of pits filled with a liquor made from ground oak and sumac bark, each pit a little stronger than the last. And you let the tannins from the bark bind slowly into the fibers of the skin, until the hide stops being something that will rot and becomes something that will last 100 years. The chrome plants do this same conversion in a single heated drum in about a day, using mineral salts, and they get a soft, pale leather that is fine for a handbag and worthless for a saddle tree that has to hold a man's weight across 10,000 miles of trail without stretching out of true. The slow way takes Walt 8 to 10 weeks a hide. And Otto's ledger told him exactly how long, in exactly what bark strength, at exactly what temperature. Because Otto had failed enough hides over enough years to know that the only thing you cannot rush is the binding. And the binding is everything. There were pages in that book where the same correction was written twice, 3 times, in a hand that grew angry, a man arguing with his own impatience across a season, and losing and writing down the loss so his grandson would not have to repeat it. To Dale Pruitt, that was inefficiency. To Walt, it was the whole inheritance. That winter, Walt kept working the way he always had, which is to say quietly, and at a loss. He sold a few sides to a custom bootmaker in Guthrie, a few more to a man who repaired tack, and he watched his account at the Coyle County State Bank thin down toward a number that would not cover the spring property tax. He was not the only one watching it. Across the section line, his nearest neighbor, and the closest thing he had to a friend, a 50-year-old operator named Russ Cobb, was watching Walt's slow decline with real worry and a plan of his own that ran the opposite direction. Russ was everything the consolidator admired. That same fall, he had borrowed against his ground to put up a climate-controlled building and a chrome tanning drum, a gleaming stainless unit financed over 7 years. And he had signed a supply contract with Dale's company to turn out 400 hides a month at a fixed price. Russ was not greedy. He had 2 kids and a wife and a mortgage, and the contract penciled out clean on the paper Dale brought him. 400 hides a month, a guaranteed buyer, a modern process any hired hand could run after a week of training. To the bank, it was the soundest loan in the county. To Russ, he told Walt as much kindly one evening at the fence, the two of them leaning on the same wire their fathers had strung, and he meant it as a lifeline. He told Walt the drum could finish in a day what the pits finished in 2 months, that the buyer was locked, that there was no shame in letting a machine carry the weight a man's back used to. He said, "You could run a clean operation off that scrap pile if you'd just let the drum do the work, Walt. I'd help you finance one. We could run them side by side." Walt listened the way he listened to everything, with his hands in his pockets and his eyes somewhere out past the men talking, and when Russ finished, Walt said only that a fixed price was fine until it wasn't. Then he whistled for Tick and walked back to the shed, and Russ watched him go and shook his head, not in anger, in the genuine sorrow of a man who believes he is watching a friend refuse a rope thrown to a drowning man. Into this came the grandson. His name was Cole. He was 24, and in the summer of 2014 he came home to Coyle County with a degree in agribusiness from Stillwater and a conviction held as firmly as any conviction Dale Pruitt ever held, that his grandfather was throwing away the last good years of his life on a craft the market had already buried. Cole loved Walt. That is the part that mattered and the part that made it hard. He had spent every childhood summer in that shed, and he had come home partly because his mother asked him to, and partly because he could not stand the thought of the old man working a pit alone at 67. He had also come home with spreadsheets. Let me tell you what Cole saw when he looked at the operation, because he was not wrong about any single fact. He saw a man spending 10 weeks to finish a hide that a drum could finish in a day. He saw 4 stone vats that had to be hauled and dumped and refilled by hand. He saw no website, no contracts, no scale, no plan for what happened when Walt's knees finally gave out. He ran the numbers on a legal pad at the kitchen table one August night, the same table where the purchase order would later be signed, the heirloom table Otto had built from a bur oak that once stood in the yard, and he slid the pad across to his grandfather and said the dismissal in the gentlest voice anyone in this story. He said, "This isn't a business, Grandpa. It's a hobby that's eating your land." Walt looked at the legal pad for a long time. The figures were honest. Tick lay under the table with his chin on Walt's boot. Then Walt did not argue, because Walt never argued. He stood up, took the lamp from its hook, and told the boy to come out to the shed. There was something he wanted him to feel with his hands. What Walt showed Cole that night was a saddle skirt he had tanned in 1991, 23 years in service on a working ranch, and brought back to him for a minor repair. The lamp threw their 2 shadows up the shed wall, tall and joined. He had Cole run his thumb along the flesh side, then handed him a piece of chrome tan skirting from a sample Russ had given him, the same age on paper. The difference was not an opinion. The old vegetable tanned piece had broken into the exact shape of the horse and the rider, and had grown denser and harder at the bars where the weight rode, a leather that had become more itself with use. The chrome piece had gone slack and greasy and had cracked along a fold, and Cole bent it and felt it give in his hands like something already half-rotted. He looked from one to the other a long while. Walt did not say anything about it. He let the boy's own hands do the talking, and then he said the only sentence of philosophy he would permit himself for years. He said, "The drum makes leather that is finished the day it is born. We make leather that is not finished until the day it dies." Cole did not convert that night. I want to be honest about the pace of this, because the easy version where the young man sees the light in one evening is a lie, and this story does not need it. Cole spent the next 2 years, half in and half out, helping in the shed in the mornings and spending his afternoons trying to build the modern business he believed in around the edges of the old one. He talked Walt into selling online. He set up a small website with photographs of finished sides, and, to his genuine surprise, the orders that came were not for cheap leather. They were from a thin scatter of custom saddle makers and high-end repair shops who had been searching for years for someone, anyone, who still did slow oak bark tannage to a working standard. The orders were few. Every one of them came with a note, and the notes all said some version of the same thing. We thought nobody made this anymore. That was the first crack in Cole's certainty. Not a conversion, a question about his own answer. Meanwhile, the consolidator kept its trucks running. And twice a year, like a season, Dale Pruitt came back to the Renner gate. The visits were never cruel. Dale would lean on his clean truck and admire the view and ask, with real warmth, whether Walt had thought any more about the pasture idea, and each time he found a new way to name the same thing. One spring he called it a heritage operation, the kind of word a man uses to be kind about something he believes is already dead. And one fall he called it a boutique liability, and offered generously to take the stone vats off Walt's hands as scrap fill. He always wore clean boots. That was the detail Cole noticed first, and could never stop noticing afterward, that a man who came to render judgment on a working tannery never once let the mud of it touch his soles, and stood always on the gravel, never on the ground where the work happened. He brought a younger associate one year, a woman with a tablet, and Walt watched Dale gesture at the shed and heard him say, not unkindly, that this was the museum. This was what the trade looked like before the numbers got honest. The woman wrote something on the tablet. She had never smelled oak liquor in her life, and did not know that the smell in the air was the smell of something being made that would outlast everyone standing in the drive. 3 times across those years, a man stood on Walt's ground and put a word on his life's work, meant to file it under finished. Walt let every one of them sit in the air the way he let questions sit, and answered none of them, and went back to the pits. Let me tell you about the pits, because by now you should understand what was actually accumulating in them while everyone above ground argued about whether it was worth anything. The thing Otto had understood and written down, and the thing the chrome plants could never put on a chart, was that the slowness was not a cost to be eliminated. The slowness was the product. When a hide moves through the bark liquor over 8 to 10 weeks, the tannins penetrate all the way to the center of the fiber bundle and bind there, and the leather that comes out is firm and dense and holds a shape under load. It can be tooled, it can be wet formed to a saddle tree, and it lasts in hard use for 40 years. Rush that conversion in a heated drum, and the salts bind only the outer fibers. And you get speed and softness and a leather that will not hold a tree and will not last a decade under a working rider. Walt could prove it with a knife. He would take a finished side and cut clean through the edge and show you the cut face, and in a true oak bark hide, the color ran solid and even from grain to flesh, the tannage gone all the way through, while the chrome side cut open showed a pale, untouched core the salts had never reached, a hide that was leather on its faces and raw in its heart. You cannot fake the cut face. It is the one test the chart cannot argue with. There was no shortcut hidden in Otto's ledger. The ledger was the absence of a shortcut, written down 100 times so no descendant would waste a life looking for one. Cole, who had come home to find the shortcut, was slowly coming to understand that the not finding was the inheritance. By 2018, the orders had grown from a trickle to a thin, steady stream, enough that Walt and Cole together could not keep up working 4 vats by hand, and Cole did a thing then that surprised even him. He did not propose buying a drum. He proposed building 2 more stone vats. He had run the numbers, the real ones now, the ones that counted what the leather actually sold for instead of what a generic hide cost to produce, and the math that had once said hobby now said something else. A finished oak bark saddle side, sold to a maker who knew what it was, brought 4 to 6 times what a chrome side brought, and there was nobody left to make it. The scarcity Dale read as death. Cole was beginning to read as a moat. He said it to his grandfather just that way, sitting at the bur oak table with the website orders printed and fanned out between them. And he heard his own voice and stopped, because he understood in that moment that he had spent 4 years arguing the old man toward the very edge the old man had been standing on the whole time. They built the vats that summer, hauling limestone from the same creek cut Otto had used in 1907, and Walt showed Cole how to set them below the frost line so the liquor would hold its even cool. And Cole wrote the depth and the date in the ledger in his own hand, the first entry he ever made in it. Tick, gray-muzzled now and slower on the stairs, supervised from the shade of the shed door, the same threshold he had slept across for nearly 20 years. Across the section line, Russ Cobb's modern operation was running exactly as designed, and that was the problem nobody could see yet. 400 hides a month, every month, at a fixed contract price that had looked generous in 2008 and had not moved since, while the cost of the mineral salts and the natural gas to heat the drum and the wastewater treatment to handle the chrome runoff had all climbed year over year. Russ was working harder than ever and clearing less. He had refinanced once already to keep the building. He waved at Cole from his drive each morning, man on a treadmill that was speeding up under him while the dial in front of him still read the same comfortable number. He still believed in the model, because the model was sound, because 400 guaranteed hides a month was the kind of certainty a man with 2 kids in school could build a life on. He was not wrong to believe it. He was only standing on a kind of ground that looks solid right up until the season it isn't. Then came 2020, and the season turned out from under everyone at once. Let me tell you what a real drought does to a feedlot county, because the numbers matter, and they came fast. The rains failed in the spring and did not return. By July, the pastures across Coyle County were grazed to dirt, and the stock ponds were cracked basins. The mud at their centers dried and curled up like broken pottery, and ranchers who could not afford to haul water and buy hay began to do the only thing left, which was to sell down their herds into a collapsing market. Cattle flooded the sale barns. Prices fell through the floor. A neighbor, 2 sections over, loaded out the cow herd his family had built for 60 years in a single morning and stood at the rail watching them go for less than the hauling cost. And he did not say a word the whole time, which is how men in that country grieve. The second blow landed soon after, the one the chrome operators never saw coming, because the same forces that broke the ranchers broke the supply chain underneath the consolidator. Natural gas for the drums spiked. The packing plants that fed the hide consolidator slowed to a crawl as the herd shrank, and the fixed-price contract that had been Russ Cobb's certainty became his trap. The consolidator squeezed itself, invoked a clause, and cut its monthly take from 400 hides to 90 at the same fixed price, with no obligation to take more. Russ had a stainless drum financed for 400 hides a month sitting nearly idle, a refinanced building, and 90 hides of income against it. He ran the math 100 ways at his own kitchen table that fall, and every way it came out the same. The certainty had been the trap all along. The thing about a fixed price, he would say later, in the shed learning the pits, is that it only feels like safety in the years you don't need it. I told you Dale Pruitt was not a villain, and here is where it mattered. Because Dale was caught in the same machine. He drove out to the Cobb place that August to deliver the cut in person, and he did not enjoy it. He had sold Russ that contract in good faith, believing the model would hold, and the model had held for 12 years, and then a structural force, larger than any of them, had walked in and broken it. Dale was a sincere man watching his own certainty fail in real time, and to his credit he did not hide from it. He had nothing to offer Russ except the clause, and the clause was the patient operation, the museum, the hobby that was eating the land, did not feel the drought the same way. Walt and Cole did not own a single head of cattle whose feed cost had quadrupled. They did not run a heated drum whose gas bill had doubled. They bought finished raw hides, as they always had, fewer now, and at strange prices, but their cost structure was a man, a grandson, oak bark, sumac, and time does not spike. While the modern operation across the section line sat idle under a contract that had become a noose, the 4 stone vats and the 2 new ones ran full, because the small scatter of saddle makers who needed real tree-fit leather still needed it, drought or no drought, and there was nobody else on the continent making it at that standard, at that scale. That is the contrast the niche turns on, and I am going to put the 2 numbers next to each other the way the year put them next to each other. In the worst 12 months Coyle County had seen since the 1,950 seconds Russ Cobb's modern tannery cleared, after the contract cut and the fixed costs almost nothing, and he missed 2 payments and put the building up for sale in the spring. In those same 12 months, the Renner operation, working slowly out of stone vats a German immigrant had built by hand, finished more leather than it ever had, and sold every inch of it because what it made could not be made faster. Which brings us to the spring of 2021 and to the man from Fort Worth. The custom saddle house had been buying Renner sides through the website for 2 years, a few at a time, and had grown tired of the uncertainty of ordering through a thin scatter of makers who all wanted the same scarce leather. They sent a buyer, a lean, silver-haired man named Hap Voss, who had spent 30 years feeling leather for a living and trusted his hands over any certificate. He did not come to chat. He drove up in a dusty older truck, no logo, and the first thing he did was ask where he could wash up, which told Walt something. He came to the shed and he asked to see the pits, and he leaned over each one and breathed in the oak liquor, the way other men breathe in coffee, and then he asked Walt to hand him a finished side from the current run. Hap took the side to the open door, into the natural light the way Otto would have, and he did the thing a qualified judge does, which is to go completely quiet. He ran his thumb across the flesh side. He folded it and watched how it broke and how it recovered, watched the grain pull tight and release without a single crack. He held it to the light and read the even penetration of the tannage all the way through the cut edge, the thing a chrome side can never show, because the chrome side is only converted skin deep. He took a small knife from his pocket and, with a glance at Walt for permission, made a clean cut at the corner and looked at the cut face and saw the color run solid from grain to flesh, and something in his shoulders changed. He stood in that doorway for the better part of 2 minutes and said nothing at all, and Cole, who had learned by now to let a silence sit, said nothing either. Tick, very old now, lay in his place across the threshold, and Hap stepped carefully over the dog without looking down, the way you step over something that belongs where it is. Then Hap Voss turned around and asked the only question that mattered. He asked how many sides like this one the operation could deliver in a year, and when Cole told him, Hap did not negotiate the price the website listed. He said he had been looking for leather like this for 11 years and had stopped believing he would find it. He took out a pad and he wrote a purchase order for a full season of tree-fit saddle leather, and he slid it across the kitchen table the same way Cole had once slid a legal pad across it, the same bur-oak table, the same lamp. The number written on the bottom line was $41,000. $41,000. It is not a large number. I told you at the start it would be smaller than you expect. A man can make $41,000 a dozen unremarkable ways. The force of a number is not its size. It is what it lands against. It landed against 13 years of a clean truck at the gate, and a word like museum left hanging in the cold air. It landed against a legal pad that said hobby, and a county that said sell it for pasture. It landed against a stainless drum, sitting idle a quarter-mile away under a contract that had promised certainty and delivered ruin. $41,000 for one season, with a 2-year waiting list standing behind it, was not a windfall. It was a verdict. It said, in the only language a balance sheet understands, that the slow thing had been the sound thing all along, and that the people who had spent 13 years calling it dead had simply been measuring with an instrument. Cole sat at that table and looked at the order and then looked at his grandfather, who had not changed his expression at all. Walt was not going to gloat. Walt did not have it in him, and the number did not need help. He folded the purchase order once the way he folded everything, and he put it in the front of Otto's ledger, between the cover and the first page Otto had written in 1907, and he closed the book. Dale Pruitt heard about it the way news travels in a small county, slowly and then all at once. He came one more time that summer, but he did not lean on his truck, and he did not bring a clipboard. He stood in the drive a while, looking at the shed he had called a museum, and then he asked Walt a question, and it was not the question he had asked for 13 years. He asked if Walt would walk him through the pits, because he wanted to understand what he had been driving past all that time. There was no cruelty in the moment, and Walt offered none. He simply set down what he was doing and showed the man the vats, 1 through 6, and explained the bark strengths the way Otto had explained them to him, and let Dale put his own hand into the cool liquor and feel the weeks of it. He cut a finished side at the corner and showed Dale the cut face. The color runs solid grain to flesh, and Dale looked at it for a long time and said quietly that the chart had never had a column for that. He had built a career on a chart that could not see the only thing that finally mattered, and he was honest enough at the end to say so out loud. Dale listened the rest of that afternoon the way a person listens when a model they trusted has finally failed and something has to take its place. That is the strongest version of what this story can do to a man like Dale. It did not defeat him. It made him a student. He stepped on his way out, around the old dog in the doorway, and this time he looked down at it. And that small thing was the measure of the whole change in him. Let me tell you what happened after, because the number is not the end. The end is what the number made possible. Russ Cobb lost the building, but he did not lose the ground, because Walt came across the section line in the worst of it and bought the stainless drum from him at a fair price he did not have to offer to keep the bank off Russ's land. He did not make a speech about it. He drove over one cold morning with coal and a trailer, and he counted out the money, and he said only that a man's ground ought to stay a man's ground. Russ went to work in the Renner shed, learning the pits at 53 the way Cole had learned them at 24, slow and stubborn and embarrassed at first, to be a beginner at his age. And within 2 years he was running the bark liquor, as well as anyone but Walt. He kept a single page of his own in the ledger now, his hand blockier than the Renner's, but careful, and he wrote down the time the way the time asked to be written down. The 2 new vats became 4. Neighbors who had watched the drought break the modern men came asking, first one and then several, standing in the drive, turning their caps in their hands, and Walt taught them freely the way Otto's ledger had always intended, because a tannage that nobody else remembers how to do is worth nothing if it dies with the man who remembers it. He sold seed bark, and he sold knowledge, and he refused every time the investors who came after the Fort Worth order to ask if the operation could scale to 10 times its size. He told them the land could grow only so much oak, and a thing that grows faster than its own roots is the thing that breaks. He had watched it break across the section line. He was not going to build it on his own ground and call it success. Cole took over the ledger in 2023. He is the one who keeps it now, in the same cramped, careful hand he taught himself to copy from Otto's pages, recording the time because the time is the thing, and he runs a brand whose entire value is that it refuses to go faster. The waiting list runs 2 years deep, and he will not shorten it by cutting a single week off a single hide. The agribusiness degree was not wasted. It is what let him read the moat for what it was when his grandfather could only feel it, what let him build the website and hold the price and turn away the investors with numbers instead of just instinct. The 2 kinds of knowing did not have to fight in the end. One of them just had to learn to listen to the other first. Here's the thing I came away with. Having walked that ground and read that ledger and stood in the doorway, where Hapvoss went quiet. We have built a whole way of measuring the world that is very good at counting what is fast and cheap and standardized, and nearly blind to what is slow and rare and alive. The instrument is not evil. Dale Pruitt was not evil. The instrument is simply built to read only one kind of value, and it mistakes the things it cannot read for things that are not there. A leather that takes 10 weeks does not show up as worth more on a labor chart. It only shows up later in the doorway, in the hands of the one person qualified to feel the difference, in the cut face where the color runs solid to the heart, the 40 years it lasts against the 10 that the fast version lasts. In the season, a drought comes, and the slow thing is the only thing still standing. There are 2 kinds of knowing in this world. One is wide and quick and confident, and can be taught in a week and printed on a chart. The other is narrow and slow and patient, and takes a life to learn, and cannot be written down except as the time it costs. We have spent a century building a civilization that rewards the first and cannot see the second. And most years it does not matter. Then comes the year it matters entirely. What is rigid breaks. What is patient holds. A tannery threw the scrap of a dying trade into a ditch and called it the end of something. And a slow old man with stained hands picked it up and carried it across 13 winters. The chrome drum sits in the back of the Renner shed to this day, unplugged, a museum of the future that did not come. And every evening when the light goes long across the vats, an old blue healer's grandson lies across the threshold of the shed where the bark liquor works in the dark. And the time does its slow and certain work, and nobody is in any hurry at all. The fast leather is finished the day it is born. The good leather is not finished until the day it dies. The same, it turns out, is true of men, and of the things they choose to know.